He sat on the bed for hours every day, praying in the hospital. One day, he simply stood up and began walking on his own. The story you're about to hear is a true account. The names of the characters and places have been changed to preserve the privacy of the individuals involved. If you believe in miracles or have experienced one yourself, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe. I still remember that day as if it were yesterday. My uncle, always so full of life and energy, suddenly became paralyzed. We took him to the hospital, hoping for a diagnosis, but nothing could have prepared us for what we were about to hear. I was there, standing by the hospital bed, when the doctor entered with a somber expression on his face. He looked at all of us, sighed deeply, and said the words that would change our lives forever. "I'm sorry, but your uncle's spinal injury is irreversible. He is paralyzed from the waist down and will likely remain so for the rest of his life." It felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath our feet. My aunt began to cry uncontrollably. My mother was in shock, and I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Doctor, there must be something we can do," I pleaded, feeling a lump in my throat. "My uncle is a fighter. He can't stay like this forever." The doctor shook his head, his eyes filled with regret. "Unfortunately, there's nothing that medicine can do in this case. The injury is too severe, and the chances of recovery are practically non-existent." I looked at my uncle, lying in that hospital bed with his eyes closed and a serene expression on his face. How could someone so strong and full of life be condemned to such a limited existence? At that moment, I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and helplessness. It was as if the world had turned upside down, and nothing made sense. I wanted to scream, cry, punch the walls, but none of that would change the cruel reality we were facing. We left the hospital room in silence, each of us lost in our own dark thoughts. The diagnosis had hit us like a lightning bolt, leaving us stunned and directionless. But even in the midst of pain and despair, I knew we had to be strong. My uncle would need all our support and love to face the challenges ahead, and I was determined to stand by his side, no matter what. Thus began our journey in search of a miracle that seemed impossible. But faith is a powerful force, and as we would soon discover, even the impossible can come true when you truly believe. In the days following the diagnosis, one thing became clear. My uncle's faith was unshakable. Even in the face of the most adverse circumstances, he refused to lose hope. I visited him every day at the hospital, and I always found him sitting on the bed, hands clasped in prayer, with a serene smile on his face. It was as if he was in a different place, connected to something much greater than any of us could comprehend. "Uncle, how can you keep your faith after everything that has happened?" I asked him once, sitting by his bed. He slowly opened his eyes and looked at me with a peaceful expression. "My son, faith isn't something you lose when things get tough. It's precisely in those moments that we need it the most." I nodded, trying to understand. "But what if there's no cure? What if you stay like this forever?" My uncle smiled again, as if he knew something I couldn't yet grasp. "God has a plan for each of us. Even if I don't understand it now, I know He is with me, and that everything happens for a reason." His words deeply moved me. I had always admired my uncle's faith, but seeing him live it so authentically and unwaveringly was something I had never witnessed before. Day by day, I watched as my uncle immersed himself more deeply in his prayers. He spent hours reading the Bible, meditating, and talking to God. It was as if he was connecting to an inexhaustible source of strength and hope. The doctors and nurses were also impressed with his attitude. They had never seen a patient so calm and confident in the face of such a devastating diagnosis. "Your uncle is an example to all of us," a nurse once said while adjusting his four. "His faith is something you don't see every day." I agreed, feeling a mix of pride and admiration. My uncle was facing the greatest battle of his life, but his faith remained unshakable. Still, I confess there were moments when I questioned it. Would faith really be enough? Would God hear my uncle's prayers and grant him a miracle? I remember one particular night when I arrived at the hospital and found my uncle silently crying. It was the first time I had seen him so vulnerable since the diagnosis. "Uncle, what happened?" I asked, concerned, sitting beside him. He wiped his tears and took a deep breath before answering. I had a moment of weakness. For an instant, I doubted my faith and felt alone. I took his hand, trying to convey all my support. "Uncle, it's normal to have doubts. No one is perfect, not even in faith." He nodded, squeezing my hand back. "I know, my son." But then, while I was praying, I felt an inexplicable peace envelop me. It was as if God was telling me to trust and persevere. In that moment, something changed within me. I realized that my uncle's faith wasn't an escape from reality, but an anchor that kept him steady in the midst of the storm. And so, day after day, week after week, my uncle continued praying and believing. His faith became a beacon of hope for all of us, lighting even the darkest days. I knew that, regardless of what happened, my uncle's faith would remain unshakable. And that alone was already a miracle. It was on a quiet night in the hospital that something extraordinary happened. I had gone to visit my uncle, as usual, but upon arriving in his room, I sensed that something was different in the air. My uncle was sitting on the bed, his eyes closed and a look of deep concentration on his face. He seemed to be in a trance, completely oblivious to the world around him. I slowly approached, not wanting to disturb him. It was then that he opened his eyes and looked at me with an intensity one had never seen before. "My son," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Something incredible just happened." I sat down next to the bed, feeling my heart race. "What was it, Uncle? Are you okay?" He smiled, and it was a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. "I had an encounter with God." My eyes widened, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "How? What happened?" My uncle took a deep breath and began to recount. "I was praying, as always, when suddenly I felt a powerful presence around me. It was as if God himself was here, in this room." I swallowed hard, feeling a mix of awe and disbelief. "And what did he say to you?" "He spoke to me, my son," my uncle responded, his voice choked with emotion. His voice was soft and comforting, and he said, "My son, rise and walk. I am with you, and I will give you strength to overcome this trial." I was speechless. It was hard to believe that something like this could happen, but at the same time, I knew my uncle wouldn't lie about something so sacred. "So, what did you do?" I asked, almost in a whisper. My uncle smiled again. I felt an indescribable energy flowing through my body. It was as if every cell was being renewed and revitalized. At that moment, I knew that something miraculous was about to happen. Tears welled up in my eyes. My uncle's faith had always inspired me, but hearing about this divine encounter was something I could never have imagined. "Uncle, that's incredible," I said, my voice breaking. "Do you believe that God is really going to heal you?" He took my hand firmly and looked into my eyes. "I have no doubt, my son. God made me a promise, and he never breaks his promises." At that moment, something shifted inside me. The faith I had always admired in my uncle suddenly became tangible, real. It was as if I could feel the presence of God there with us, in that hospital room. We remained silent for a few moments, absorbing the magnitude of what had happened. It was as if the world had stopped, and all that mattered was that sacred moment. Finally, I broke the silence. "Uncle, I believe you. And I believe that God is going to perform a miracle in your life." He squeezed my hand, and I saw tears of gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you, my son. Your faith means so much to me." I left the room that night with a sense of peace and hope that I had never experienced before. Something had changed, not just in my uncle, but in me as well. I knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. My uncle's divine encounter had opened a door to the extraordinary, and I couldn't wait to see what God had in store for us. Because, in the end, when you have faith, anything is possible. Even the most improbable miracles come true in the eyes of those who believe. The morning after my uncle's divine encounter, I woke up with a strange feeling in my chest. It was as if something big was about to happen, but I didn't know exactly what. I quickly got ready and rushed to the hospital, eager to see how my uncle was doing. When I arrived at his room, my heart nearly stopped. There he was, standing beside the bed, walking on his own, without any assistance. It was as if the paralysis had never existed. "My God," I exclaimed, my voice trembling with emotion. "Uncle, how is this possible?" He turned to me, and the smile on his face was the brightest I had ever seen. "It was a miracle, my son. God has healed me and given me a second chance at life." I ran to embrace him, tears streaming down my face. It was hard to believe what my eyes were seeing. My uncle, who had been condemned to a life of paralysis, was now walking as if nothing had happened. I can't believe it," I said, my voice breaking. "It's a true miracle." My uncle took my face in his hands and looked into my eyes. "Never doubt the power of God, my son. He is capable of doing the impossible if we have faith." At that moment, a commotion began to build in the room. Nurses and doctors entered, drawn by the shouts of joy and amazement. They all froze when they saw my uncle standing, walking as if nothing had happened. This is impossible," one of the doctors stammered, his eyes wide with astonishment. "The injury was irreversible. There's no medical explanation for this." My uncle smiled serenely. "Not everything can be explained by medicine, doctor. This is the work of God." The doctors began asking questions, examining my uncle from head to toe, trying to find a logical explanation for what had happened. But there was none. All the tests showed that the injury was still there, but somehow, my uncle had regained movement. The news of the miracle spread quickly throughout the hospital. Patients, staff, and visitors crowded the hallway, trying to catch a glimpse of the man who had been healed by faith. My uncle, always humble, didn't let the attention go to his head. He loudly thanked God and began to share his story with anyone who wanted to listen. "I was praying last night when I felt God's presence surrounding me," he said, his eyes shining with emotion. "He told me to rise and walk, and I simply obeyed. It was the most incredible feeling I've ever experienced." People listened, amazed, some crying with emotion. It was as if my uncle's faith had become contagious, touching the hearts of everyone around him. In the days that followed, my uncle's miracle became the talk of the town. Journalists came to interview him, and his story was told in newspapers and on television programs. But for me, the true miracle wasn't just my uncle's physical healing. It was the transformation I saw happening in the people around us. I saw people who had lost their faith reconnect with hope. I saw terminally ill patients cling to my uncle's story as a beacon of light in the midst of darkness. I saw families come together in prayer, believing that if God could heal my uncle, he could do the same for them. And me? I found myself changed as well. The faith I had always admired in my uncle now burned within me with an intensity one had never known before. Because I had witnessed a miracle. I had seen the impossible become reality before my eyes. And that, more than anything else, made me believe that nothing is impossible for God. My uncle's unexpected miracle wasn't just a physical healing. It was a powerful reminder that faith can move mountains and transform lives in ways we could never imagine. Despite the undeniable miracle that happened to my uncle, not everyone was ready to accept the extraordinary. The doctors, in particular, found themselves in a dilemma, trying to reconcile what they had witnessed with their scientific knowledge. Dr. Oliveira, the physician responsible for my uncle's case, was the first to express his doubts. He was a man of science, used to finding logical explanations for everything. "This simply doesn't make sense," he said, staring at my uncle's tests with a perplexed expression. "The spinal injury is clear on the scans. There's no way someone with this type of damage can just stand up and walk." My uncle, always patient, smiled at the doctor. "Doctor, not everything can be explained by science. This was a miracle from God." Dr. Oliveira shook his head, skeptical. "Miracles don't exist. There must be a medical explanation for this, something we haven't discovered yet." He assembled a team of specialists to study my uncle's case. Neurologists, orthopedists, and even a psychiatrist were called in to try and find an answer. They ran every test possible: MRI scans, CT scans, blood tests, but nothing explained my uncle's miraculous recovery. "This defies all the laws of medicine," admitted one of the specialists, clearly frustrated. "There are no precedents for a case like this." Doctors convened at conferences, discussing my uncle's case, trying to find a scientific explanation. Some suggested it could be a case of spontaneous remission, others talked about the placebo effect. But none of the theories seemed to fit perfectly. Meanwhile, my uncle continued his life, grateful for every step he could take. He returned home, resumed his work, and even began attending church with more devotion. But the doctors didn't give up. They continued studying the case, reviewing every detail, every test, searching for an answer. It was then that Dr. Oliveira had a candid conversation with my uncle. I was present, listening closely to every word. "Mr. Silva, I know you believe this was a miracle," the doctor said, with a serious expression. "But as a man of science, I need to find a logical explanation for what happened." My uncle smiled kindly. "Doctor, I understand your search for answers. But sometimes, life gives us something beyond our understanding. Something that defies logic and reminds us that there are greater forces at work." Dr. Oliveira sighed, looking tired. "I want to believe that, Mr. Silva, but my training, everything I've learned, it's hard to accept something that goes against all of that. Faith isn't something that can be explained, doctor. It's something that is felt, something that is lived. And I am living proof that miracles can happen when we have faith." Those words seemed to touch something inside Dr. Oliveira. He looked at my uncle with a mix of admiration and confusion. Maybe I need to rethink my worldview," he admitted, almost reluctantly. "Maybe there's more between heaven and earth than science can explain." It was a moment of epiphany for Dr. Oliveira. He, who had always relied on science and logic, was now faced with something that challenged everything he knew. And he wasn't the only one. Many of the doctors who followed my uncle's case began to question their own beliefs. Some turned to faith, seeking answers that science could not provide. Others remained skeptical, clinging to the idea that there had to be a logical explanation, even though they hadn't found it yet. But one thing was certain. My uncle's miracle had shaken the foundations of medical knowledge. It showed that sometimes, faith can achieve the impossible, even in the face of skepticism and disbelief. And for those of us who witnessed this miracle, like me, it became clear that science doesn't always have all the answers. That there are mysteries in this world that go beyond our understanding. Despite my uncle's undeniable miracle, the story still held a surprising revelation that no one could have predicted. A few weeks after the miraculous recovery, one of the nurses who had cared for my uncle approached me. He seemed nervous, as if he was about to reveal a very important secret. "I need to tell you something," he said, looking around to make sure we were alone. "Something I saw that night, when your uncle was healed." I looked at him, feeling a chill run down my spine. "What did you see?" The nurse took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "I saw a luminous figure next to his bed. It was like an angel, surrounding him with a warm, healing light." My eyes widened in surprise. "An angel? Are you sure?" He nodded, still visibly affected by the memory. I had never seen anything like it before. It was such a powerful presence, so full of love. It left me speechless. I felt my heart race. The idea that an angel might have visited my uncle that night, bringing the divine cure, was overwhelming. "Why didn't you tell anyone before?" I asked, my voice trembling. The nurse lowered his gaze, ashamed. "I was afraid. Afraid no one would believe me, that they'd think I was crazy. But I can't keep this secret anymore. I had to tell the truth." I placed my hand on his shoulder, trying to offer comfort. "You did the right thing. This revelation only confirms what we already knew, that what happened to my uncle was a true miracle." The news of the nurse's vision spread quickly, leaving everyone astonished. Those who already believed in the miracle had their convictions reinforced, while the skeptics faced a new mystery to unravel. My uncle, always humble, received the revelation with serenity. "I knew I wasn't alone that night," he said, with a soft smile. "I could feel God's presence by my side, healing me, restoring me." The story of the angel became an integral part of my uncle's miracle. People came from far and wide to hear his testimony, to touch his hands, and to ask for blessings. And my uncle, with his unwavering faith, welcomed everyone with love and compassion. He became a symbol of hope for those who were suffering, a living reminder of the power of faith. But the revelation of the angel also brought a new level of introspection for many of us. It made us question our own faith, our own connection with the divine. I, who had been a close witness to this entire process, felt a deep transformation within me. The faith I had always admired in my uncle now burned inside me with an overwhelming intensity. I began to see the world with new eyes. Every sunrise felt like a miracle, every smile a gift from God. I found myself seeking a deeper connection with spirituality, trying to understand the mysteries that surround us. And I wasn't alone. Many of those who heard my uncle's story and the angel's revelation felt similarly touched. It was as if a collective awakening was happening, a call to look beyond appearances and seek the divine in our lives. My uncle's miracle, which began as a story of physical healing, became something much greater. It turned into a catalyst for the spiritual transformation of countless people, a powerful reminder that there is more to this world than what our eyes can see. And I, as a privileged witness to this miracle, feel both honored and humbled. Honored to have witnessed something so extraordinary, and humbled by the greatness and mystery of God. Because in the end, the true miracle was not just my uncle's physical healing. It was the transformation it sparked in all of us. The way his unwavering faith inspired us, challenged us, and made us grow. And that is the most lasting legacy of this miracle. Not just the story of a man healed by divine intervention, but the story of how that healing touched and transformed countless lives, including mine. And for that, I will be eternally grateful.